Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pashala. I am Dr. Anurekhachari Wagh, Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss a module titled Labour Migration, Trends and Implications. This module is part of the larger paper titled Agrarian Social Structure and Change. This paper is coordinated by Dr. Manish Thakur, IIM, Kolkata. In this module titled Labour Migration, Trends and Implications 1, we are going to focus on different dimensions of migration patterns in India. Further, we will also look into how there are different types of migration, giving an overview of these types. Further, in this module, we will also look into the causes of rural labour migration. At the end, we will look into the living and working conditions of migrant workers in India. Labour migration trends and implications 1. Migration is associated with a fundamental aspect of human being, including food, shelter and security. It has a major impact on the economic and social situation of a country, as it plays an important role in shaping identity, language, religion, education of a person or community. The term migration refers to the movement of a people or a person from one place to another, but such a movement is different from a casual visit and a tour. In reality, it is a survival instinct that drives humans to seek better prospects. The census of India defines migration in this way. When a person is enumerated in census at a different place than his or her place of birth, she or he is considered a migrant. It has been reported that in 2010, 3% of the world population migrated outside the country of origin. In India, marriage is the most common reason for migration among women. Women too migrate for work, though. As a rule, men mostly migrate for work. According to the census report of 2001, the total number of migrated people by the place of birth is more than 307 million, and the number of place of last residence is 314 million. Migration is of great scholarly interest to students of society and culture. There is plenty of research on the processes of migration and the causes of migration, adaptation of the migrated people to new locations and settings, and consequences of migration on people and communities concerned. It has been observed that migration has an effect on all areas of human life, including economy, marriage, household, formation, politics, religion, communication, and so on. Workers migrated send money or the goods to their families, which is known as remittances. These remittances constitute a significant proportion of the global economy and sometimes of the country's economy. The Times of India, a popular newspaper, reported on 3rd October 2013 that India received the highest amount of remittance in the world. The obvious point is that labour migration does not always respect the national boundary. People, even poor illiterate villagers, go to other countries in search of livelihood. For example, large number of Indian labourers migrate to the Gulf country for work. Punjabi workers are found in large numbers in cheese and bread making units in Italy. Some of them take on the role of farmers in countries like Canada and Australia. Besides, we have well-trained software professional and managers working in the developed world. In this module, though, we are not concerned about out-country migration that comes under separate domain of diaspora studies. In fact, scholars categorize migration into many types. In this module, we are primarily focusing on the migration of rural workers. Census of India 2001 has reported that more than 73 million rural people migrate to other urban and rural areas. The share of rural to rural migration is 53 million, is quite higher than that of rural to urban migration, 20 million. Types of migration. Migration can be classified into two types on the basis of political boundaries. Broadly, there are internal migration and international migration. Internal migration denotes movement of people or a person within boundaries of a country or a nation state. For example, if a person moves from West Bengal to Delhi, it would be internal migration. On the other hand, many people from Nepal come to India in search of jobs. This is an example of international migration as they move across national boundaries. Scholars such as David, Miller, Danaker have talked about another type of migration called transnational migration, in which people move to two or more countries but keep various kinds of ties with their homelands as create a new cultural identity. By the term of 20th century, rural to urban migration became pronounced in many countries including India. It is mainly because of availability of work in urban areas. Rural poor laborers are given legal contracts to work for a specific period of time in some distant places. They migrate to those places of work, but they do not have any intention to live there permanently. This type of migration is called wage labor migration. International migration became prominent mainly after the Second World War and again in the mid-1980s. People migrate internationally mostly because of work-related reasons. Since the last quarter of the 20th century, a substantial number of skilled young men and women have migrated to the United States, Canada, Australia, and other countries of the global north. This trend not only continues in the 21st century but has also gained momentum in the wake of globalization. But then people also migrate under duress. Natural and man-made calamities such as famine, civil war, ethnic wars, and outbreak of fatal diseases lead to displacement of people. For instance, apart from United States, Canada, and Australia, a large number of Turkish people went to Germany in the last part of 20th century. On the other hand, many Iraqi and Iranian Kurdish people have taken refuge in Turkey. When people are forced to migrate, they are called displaced people. Evidently, such displacements are primarily caused by war, natural disaster, construction of dam, colonialism. Large number of displaced persons are refugees. According to UNHCR, 51.2 million people in the world are refugees. When people are forced to migrate for a development process, the migration is called development-induced displacement. It has been reported that approximately 80 million people have been displaced since the 1950s due to the construction of dams alone. In India, construction of high dams in Narmada River has displaced almost 1.5 million people from their land. Transnational laborers move from one place to another depending upon the demand for the labor. Many women, mostly Asian women, are working abroad. Large number of Sri Lankan and Filipino women work as domestic help in the Gulf countries. Vietnamese women go to South Korea to work as nannies. The International Labour Migration Report has noted that today women represent around half of the total population of the international migrants worldwide. The migrated women workers are mainly engaged in nursing, teaching, domestic services. In cities, many migrant women work as domestic household help. They have their permanent homes in the rural areas. They send their remittances to their families back in the village. Once or twice a year, they visit home to meet the family members. This type of labor movement is termed as circular migration. In temporary or circular migration, workers move to the destination place for a limited period of time after accomplishing the work to return to their homesteads. For the last 4 decades or so, Bihari laborers have been going to the Green Revolution areas of Punjab and Haryana during the peak agricultural season. Once they complete their task there, they return home and the cycle goes on. This is known as seasonal or spontaneous migration. Regional disparities, uneven development and decline of agricultural sectors push poor people of many Asian countries in temporary migration. Scholars like Brow, Deshinkar, Akhtar, Deshinkar, Green have noted that rate of temporary migration has increased in the last 2 decades in the South, Southeast Asia and East Asia. Temporary or seasonal migration has been an alternative source of livelihood and a survival strategy for the rural poor. It has been estimated that in 1999-2001, approximately 9.3% of the rural workforce across the country undertook a seasonal migration. Such migration has significant implications for the functioning of labor markets in both rural and urban areas. In terms of temporality, scholars talk about 2 types of migration: long-term and seasonal or periodic. The former type of migration is due to a certain conjuncture of historical circumstances for which one can only point the trend and not the precise date. For example, Goans migration to East Africa in the early 20th century or Goans migration to Mumbai in the late 19th and early 20th century fall under this category. One can also refer to the long-range migrations of some of the tribal groups from the Santal Paragna Plateau to the tea gardens of Assam and those in this category. The season or periodic migration is informed by a different rhythm of temporality where people migrate at a different time with a clear purpose of returning to their places of origin sooner than later. Large number of tribal groups from Odisha migrate seasonally to work in bricklands in the neighboring Andhra Pradesh. Likewise, some groups in Kerala seasonally migrate to Gujarat to work in shrimp farming. You should note that circular, short-term, cyclical, oscillatory, temporary, spontaneous migrations are some of the other terms used in literature. In essence, it connotes a particular form of mobility of labor based on the uneven demand for labor in agriculture. Agricultural activities are generally indexed to the high demand of labor during peak period and the low demand for labor during the slack season. It is generally believed that much of the rural to urban labor migration is seasonal in nature. Very often, once the kharif harvest is over, scores of rural laborers migrate to other areas and towns for a certain period of time. In literature, we routinely come across certain categories of seasonal migrants such as Haveli workers from Mandla, Madhya Pradesh, sugarcane cutters from Medak district, Telangana, earth workers from Chittor district, Andhra Pradesh, and rice planters from Purulia, West Bengal. Causes of rural labor migration. Labor migration is one of the well-studied subjects in social sciences. Scholars have looked at the different aspects of labor migration from different perspectives, such as the dual economy model and the Marxist model. According to the dual economy model, laborers migrate from rural or traditional lower paid sectors to the industrialized higher paid sectors in hope of getting jobs. But the industrial areas have a limited capacity to absorb and surplus agricultural laborers. As the point of saturation reaches the industrial market, wages begin to decline and migrant workers begin to compete among themselves to get the job. On the other hand, Marxist model emphasized structural changes as the cause of labor migration instead of giving too much importance to the migrants' agency. Rural labor forces are pumped into urban areas to enable the employers to exploit the available surplus labor in non-agricultural sectors as a consequence of structural changes in the economy. It results into rural-urban migration in many countries, including India. It is mainly because of the availability of work in the urban areas. In this context, the push and pull theory of labor migration argues that rural traditional economy fails to support population growth and increasing demand concerning the quality of life. In such situations, cities lure people by providing them with employment opportunities. Therefore, the evident lack of opportunities in the rural areas is a push factor, whereas the availability of work in urban areas is a pull factor. The rural laborers assess the cost and benefit of rural versus urban life and then decide to migrate to urban areas. Sometimes rural poor laborers are given legal contracts to work for a specific period of time in some distant places. Besides demographic pressures, scarcity of natural resources such as water, forest materials, declining agricultural production, natural disasters including drought and flood and some of the factors abetting labor migration. In some quarters, the migrant laborers are also termed as ecological refugees. However, Mose et al. Are of the opinion that ecological crises or subsistence failures are not only the causes of migration. Migration is also the function of an existing social relations, including debt burden and socioeconomic dependency on others in the countryside. They view labor migration in two ways. From one point of view, it is a forced livelihood response. In other ways, it also provides a positive opportunity to earn more, save, invest, and create assets. Rural people take loans from local money lenders, mostly for expenses on life cycles, rituals, agricultural, medical emergency. They are charged very high, almost usurious rate of interest. Income from subsistence agriculture or wages is never enough for payment. So as a rule, after the harvest season is over, large scale of villagers are forced to migrate in search of jobs in the urban informal economy. The agents, that is the labor contractors, are also called sardars and mukaddams, give them money on advance. As they have no alternative livelihood option, they agree to work in distant places as cheap laborers. Sure enough, temporary or seasonal migration has been an alternative source of income and survival strategy for the poor people for long. In general, rural poor migrate to cities and crowd in construction projects or in informal sectors. The landless laborers who are entrapped in debt go to places far and near to earn some additional money. Brow argues that low-income households are more susceptible to migration than others, and temporary migration is high in those states where inequality is more pronounced. School of New Economics of Labor Migration considers temporary migration as a risk diversification strategy of the poor people. Viewed thus, seasonal migration is not always weather determined. Instead, it is best seen as a routine activity that continues across generations. It is estimated that in 1999-2001, approximately 9.3% of rural workforce across the country undertook seasonal migration. Migrant labor get jobs in 3 different ways. First, through local contractors who organize potential and willing villagers to give cash in advance. Second, people use their social networks, friends, relatives, and other support systems to get jobs during the lean agriculture season. And third, many people work as daily wage earners on their own in urban casual market. There is a well-organized informal system of labor contracting characterizing seasonal migration. In parts of South India, it is called Palamur contract system, whereas in the eastern part, it is called Datan. In villages, however, there are some local labor contractors. They are money lenders and they work in close connection with the money lenders. They are given commissions from bigger contractors to organize laborers. They offer contracts in different places depending upon the demand for labor with a sum of cash in advance to the potential workers. People who take loans from the money lenders are also forced to sign up the contract. Local contractors take the advantage of the distress condition to maximize their commission. Apart from this, rural workers are also willing to migrate because wages outside the villages are much better than the local villages. These villages are determined through negotiation between laborers and contractors, and the rates also depends on the personal skill of the worker. You can view this multimedia presentation which is present to get an informed idea of the reasons behind labor migration. In fact, agrarian distress turns out to be the key theme in scholarly discussions on causes for rural labor migration. It is commonly believed that agriculture as such is no longer an activity that can assure dignified livelihood to the majority of the villagers. Fragmentation of land holdings due to demographic pressures, monsoon-dependent nature of irrigation, lack of public investment in irrigation and agriculture infrastructure, besides floods and droughts, have rendered agriculture an unprofitable activity to a large extent. In those areas where cash crops are grown, the increasing dependence on the markets and heavy investment on credit for new types of seeds, fertilizers, insecticides and pesticides have given rise to the cycle of indebtedness in case of crop failure, leading to the phenomenon of farmer suicide. In a way, Indian agriculture suffers from 2 types of vulnerabilities: nature-related and market-induced vulnerabilities. The cumulative outcome is a decreasing capacity of agriculture to be the hold for sector for employment of the available rural labor. As a consequence, villagers are forced to eke out a living through migration. In general, migrants are poverty-stricken and severely indebted owing to the acute agricultural crisis that prevails within the Indian economy, in particular since the introduction of economic reforms in the early 1990s. Given the rise of rural non-farm employment, agriculture is becoming less important source of livelihood even in the rural areas. The symmetry between the village and the agriculture is getting disrupted as more and more villagers join the reserve army of labor in the urban informal sector. Today, a growing number of villagers earn their living through non-farm based economic activities. Conditions of rural migrant laborers. Migrant laborers are mostly unskilled. According to a report published in The Economist 23 February 2014, an influential global weekly, almost 70% of the working population in India does not have more than primary education. Given such abysmally low level of skill sets, it is no surprise that majority of the migrant workers are employed as casual, low-paid workers. They are employed in construction works, brick making, carrying heavy loads, stone breaking, digging, and many other types of manual work. They also frequently change jobs, and over time they become semi-skilled and skilled laborers such as masons, plumbers, electricians, fitters, mechanics, and even labor contractors. Employers prefer migrant laborers to local laborers because the wage rate of the migrated laborers is generally less than that of the local laborers. So they send agents in villages to organize cheap laborers for a certain period of time. Mose et al. Provide an instance. If the wage rate of the local laborer is 60 rupees per day, the wage rate of a migrant laborer would be 40 to 45 rupees. In addition to this, they work for longer hours as they mostly stay in or near the construction site. It provides flexibility of working hours from the employer's point of view. Also, there are little chances of absenteeism and consequently assured labor supply. We should not think that all migrants are poor. In fact, migrant laborers can be classified into 2 types depending on their economic background. First, there are migrants who come from economically better off families they do not have subsistence, failure of food scarcity. They cover short distance for a shorter period of time. Younger male members of such families generally migrate, whereas women and aged kinsmen maintain farm and other domestic activities. In contrast, large numbers of migrant laborers are poor. They move long distances for a longer period of time with their families. The poor generally migrate with the family members in order to increase the productivity of their labor power. The income of migrant laborers depend on several factors such as period of migration, location, type of work, advances taken, transportation and living costs. The wage rates of men and women sometimes vary. The working conditions of the migrant laborers are dreadful to say the least. Men and women work in the same site but they have different tasks. For example, men are breaking stones whereas women are carrying and transporting the stone from one place to another. These performances are closely monitored. Mose et al. Observes that in a construction site, a woman laborers are given a target to carry 400 headstones a day. They are given a token after each successful transfer of loads. If they fail to fulfill the target, the wages are reduced proportionately. They mostly stay in the work sites. The environment of these places, particularly of the quarries, lignans and factories, are not safe. They are not provided proper safety measures against risky equipment, chemicals or poisonous gases. They lead their lives on a poor diet. They largely reside in open spaces. Sometimes they get shelters in unfinished buildings, or sometimes they make temporary tents with torn plastic sheets. They lack access to some basic utilities like toilets, potable water, basic health care and education facilities for their children. As a result, most of the migrant laborers suffer from serious health hazards. Employers offer little compensation in case of harsh injury or death. Workers are rarely paid medical expenses. They have to bear the cost of medical treatment out of their meager savings, which generally put them in another spiral of indebtedness. In urban areas, firewood which they use as cooking fuel is expensive. In bivouac, there is no security for their personal belongings. If they find a safe place to stay, they agree to walk long hours for work. Many laborers bring food grains from the houses because in unknown urban areas, food may be expensive. Apart from the toilsome jobs, they face humiliation, social isolation, and unequal measure. In particular, tribal migrant workers are perceived as ill-washed, uneducated, and uncivilized. The migrant laborer continued their domestic complications and reproductive roles together with the wage labor. The women laborers suffer from pregnancy complications and miscarriages. Childcare is always a problem for the migrant families. Some migrant families bring an older child with them to look after the infant. Usually, parents face their children in the work site. The children spend a considerable period of the grown-up phase in the work site. Over the years, they become familiar with the work and begin to work with the parents. They are generally deprived of schooling. Migrant workers in the informal sectors are devoid of any sort of legal protection. It is not that the legislations do not exist. Indeed, there are legislations such as Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act 1970, Bonded Labor System Abolition Act of 1975, Minimum Wages Act 1948, Equal Remuneration Act for Women 1976, Construction Workers Act 1996, and Interstate Migrant Workmen Act 1979. It is also important that the government labor officers are not well aware of the difficulty of the migrant women, but they always have often a favorable disposition towards the employer. The registers of the laborers are not maintained properly. The government inspectors rarely monitor such negligence. Migrant workers who are employed in the informal sectors do not have any proper record of service. It disempowers them from seeking any legal protection in case such need arises. After all, asymmetries in power existing between employers and the migrant laborers are guarantee enough against any serious pursuit of legal redressal on part of the migrants. Be that as it may be, there is no denying that migration is an inevitable part of the modern narratives of rural agricultural labor. Looking at seasonal migration as a dynamic socio-political process of labor movement, Al-Pasha argues us to look beyond the economic determinants for a sound understanding of migration. According to her, migration also entails varieties of societal freedom, freedom from oppressive structures of joint family, village community, and the prevalent caste-based norms. Also, migrants have an agency to choose such freedoms. For her, everything about migration is not about narrative of exploitation and expropriation. It is time we wrote another narrative of freedom into it. She considers a liberating possibility of development of new license among migrants and contrasts that to the inhibiting ambience of the village. Likewise, some other scholars too view migration-induced labor circulation as a process that leads to an environment of rural cosmopolitanism, which enables people to break with the conventional spaces of work and provides them with greater detail. In the next module, that is 4.4b, we will examine some of those issues in greater detail. Next module will also give you a peep into the life and livelihoods of rural agricultural women migrants. Indeed, there is a large number of field-based studies yielding such great insight into the nature of seasonal migration. Yet it is difficult to generalize about the nature, characteristics, and dynamics of migration across states and regions. However, some migrant groups remain etched in our memory. For example, Rogoli's 1995 work tells us about the Khandeshi migrants working in sugarcane harvesting in Gujarat and about the nature of migrants' work in Rayalaseema district in Andhra Pradesh. Likewise, we know about the lives of those Nepali migrants who work in the apple orchards in Himachal Pradesh. In any case, since module 4.4b is a continuation of this module, you will find all the references used in this module there. Extensive research on migration has made certain things part of a received wisdom. For instance, we know that Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal are some of the states sending highest number of migrants to other states. Likewise, destinations for the migrant workers too keep on changing depending upon many factors such as wage rates, peaceful working conditions, better law and order, pre-existing kin, and village network. For example, Bihari workers were earlier migrating to eastern parts of the country where they would call Purab, meaning whereby the states of West Bengal, Assam and northeastern states. However, in the 1970s, the Bihari laborers started migrating in droves to Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh. Whereas the West Bengal saw an industrial decline and lost much of its charm as an economic hub, the northeastern states turned out to be unsafe for the Biharis owing to the growing ethnic politics there. As a consequence, Bihari workers have found other destinations such as Gujarat, Daman and Diu, Kerala, Tamil Nadu more attractive in the last decade or so. In conclusion to this module titled Labour Migration Trends and Implications, we have understood that labour migration is an inevitable process of development due to various push and pull factors. We have also looked at how seasonal migration, especially in the process of labour movement. Further, we have also looked into how we need to go beyond the narratives of exploitation and experience and issues of poverty, issues of violence to focus more on the positive aspects of labour migration. The idea is to focus on how the process of migration could also lead to more freedom and more choice for many of the rural labourers in India. Thank you.